Hello, everybody. It is 9 o'clock Eastern Time on Saturday. This is Starfleet Tactical. I am Chris Weave, and tonight we're going to be talking about the Outsider webcomic for reasons that I'll make clear once we get into it. But I am going to do something I was asked specifically last episode, to always show my t-shirt and read it to everybody. So now I'm going to do the t-shirt phase. This is a t-shirt. It says Cheddar Monk, Lawful Good in Theory. It is from the Darths and Droids comic. Some of you may recall that there was a web comic, and I'm drawing DM of the Rings, that somebody did screen captures from the Lord of the Rings as if it, and did a comic as if it was somebody's role-playing campaign. And then a group of people then got together and did the same thing for the Star Wars movies. And so as part of the voluminous backstory, it was explained to the characters that they were Jedi Knights, and the one character just couldn't remember what he was supposed to be, and so he kept calling himself a Cheddar Monk. And the lawful good in theory came because he wasn't really very lawful good. So if any event, I recommend it. I need to go back and just basically start from the beginning and read it all the way through, because it really was pretty good. And I need to reread DM of the Rings as well. So in any event, tonight we're here to talk about, we're going to talk about the webcomic Outsider, which is a nice companion to the Albedo stuff, because there's certain things about it that I think are very similar to Albedo. And so I even borrowed an illustration from Outsider to illustrate something that was in Albedo last time. So I'm going to go ahead. Let me go ahead and pull the slides up. Lissa is behind the scenes waiting for the storm to come through and take her power away. So, and she's giving me the thumbs up.
I am indeed. I heard the wind rustle up a little bit not too long ago. Hopefully that's nothing, but I know around 10, 11, we're supposed to get a bad storm front there that spawn tornadoes for everyone else. So
yeah, so I once was the StreamYard tech guy for a show for something called NavyCon, which had a huge number of people in the Washington, D.C. area that were presenting. And right before we were supposed to go live, a storm came through. And one guy who was scheduled to be on at the end, his power went out at his house. So he got in his car and he drove like 45 minutes to his office so that he could do it from his office, because he knew they'd have power there. And that worked out for him. Somebody else, literally by the end of her talk, she was doing StreamYard by doing it on her cell phone, and she was taking a picture of her laptop as she went through the slides. And this woman acted like this was the totally most normal thing in the world.
Show must go on.
Nothing fazed her. The show must go on. And it did. It did. She did a fantastic job. So it was one of those shared adversity things. There was lots of bonding taking place. It was pretty cool.
Well, the good news is I do have most of the necessary equipment things on backup power supplies. So I won't just go away, but if my power does go out, I will say something behind the scenes and have to pop out.
Yeah.
Because since it is nighttime, these lights on the backup power supply are like the main way to see in the house.
Yes. And, it's like just a little behind the scenes for people that are thinking about getting into the StreamYard business. 9 times out of 10, the producer will help out by like sort of reading through stuff and bring something to the presenter's attention if they need to know about it, and maybe do some housekeeping chores here and there. 9 times out of 10, the producer, you could get by without a producer, and I know plenty of people.
I'm a glorified mod most nights if things are going correct.
and this is not a rowdy crowd, and so we don't, usually it's pretty good. But the thing about the producer is that when things go south from a technical standpoint, the presenter has
to troubleshoot.
Yeah.
So you don't have to.
We've had that happen before where something went south for some reason. And like it's especially the case, like I know how to use StreamYard, Lissa knows how to use StreamYard. Either one of us could be our own producer and it's not that big a deal. But when you've got other people that are coming on and you're having to, somebody's got to walk them through a technical issue they're having so that they can then join the stream. Yep. As if I'm in front of the camera and I'm doing the song and dance about we'll be with you in just a second, folks, I can't be walking the other guy through. So yeah, producers for StreamYard stuff is really sort of you're a damn fine parachute, Lissa. You're a damn fine parachute.
That is what the producer is there for. Most days you don't need me, but when you need me, you need me.
Exactly. And I'm glad to have you here. So, okay. All right. So, welcome everybody. I see a lot of the usual suspects here. I don't see my brother Delon because he's probably in the process of moving because he literally just bought a house and just moved into it. And there was going to be storms and stuff in Iowa too. And so he's probably slogging through the snow, taking a load of laundry or something over to his new house. In any event, like I said, Delon is here. He is here. Okay. So like I said, I'm going to talk about the Outsider webcomic. And so, but first, a few announcements, as I always do. You notice that there's a little bit different format here. So the standard things apply. My opinion's not my employer's. That applies to everybody else who's on the show as well. All the images are property of the people who put them together. In this case, it's a guy named Jim Francis who does fantastic work. I suggest that you support him. I support him like through Patreon, or I forget exactly how I do it. I think it's through Patreon. I think he goes by the name Ariok, if I remember correctly, but his real name, I believe, is Jim Francis because that's what his copyright says. So he does fantastic work, and I'm using the images without talking to him. But I'm doing it for purposes of critiquing the images and providing educational benefit. And I'll also point out that as far as I know, this guy's still alive. At least he was as of October, the last time he put up a new page. And as a result, he may very well disagree with some of the stuff that I'm saying. I haven't run anything by him, so I don't know. So right now, I'm scheduled to do the show through the end of May with the exception of the 26th of April. Now, I actually don't think that that's going to hold. And the reason why I say that I don't think that's going to hold is because I think that I'm going to be doing some traveling in there. And there's actually, for reasons I won't go into now, but they're not bad reasons at all, there's actually a really good chance I may end up like missing the entire month of May. But we'll see. And I'll let you know when things happen. It's also worth pointing out, in April, I'm going to be running the Connections Online conference. The overall conference is from the 7th through the 12th, but the core is the 3 days of 8, 9, 10 April. It runs from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. I call that time zone, that's the Washington State to Warsaw time zone. It is a professional wargaming conference. If you have any interest in professional wargaming, and we define professional quite broadly, feel free to come on and view it. And as soon as we actually have the scheduling information up and the ticketing information, I'll let you know. We generally charge $5. And the only reason we really do that is because we've got this StreamYard addiction, and StreamYard ain't cheap. And more importantly, the real reason we do it is because we've discovered that if you throw a couple of bucks on, people will sign up and say they're going to go to stuff if it's totally free. You throw a couple of bucks on, make them pay like just a nominal fee, and they're more likely to actually show up. And that helps by asking questions. Well, why am I explaining to you guys why it's good to watch stuff in real time and ask questions in real time? You guys understand this already. So Here's the list of the things that I kind of have in the queue, and you'll notice that I added another one. I no longer say the next 3 to 5 things because it's clearly not 3 to 5 things, but I added Chris Muller's Iron Empires onto this. And so Iron Empires consists of 3 graphic novels, a role-playing game called Burning Empires, which is based on the Burning Wheel system, and a companion volume called Bloodstained Stars that purports to be a military manual written in in-universe style. And it has some very, very interesting technological stuff that affects combat in that universe. I'll end up focusing on the space combat, although I'll probably talk about the science fiction ground combat a little bit more, but I'm just more interested in the Navy stuff. And it's actually really, really, really fantastic. And I was sharing it with Andy Presby earlier today, and he's going, wow, that looks like a really good background. So I decided I needed to do that at some point too. And it'll be like a one-off when I do it. Just like tonight. I'm expecting tonight to be a one-off. So that having been, let's go ahead and move on. And here's the agenda. We're going to talk about Outsider. I'm going to tell you what it is. I'm going to give you a sort of an approach and an overview. I'm going to talk about the background of the game, in-universe background. We'll talk a little bit about tactical space combat, and then we'll get to the jump drive, and you'll see there's that comparison with albedo portion. That's why this is here, because when I first saw Outsider, it's like, wow, this jump drive that they have here is really similar to the albedo drive and has a lot of similar implications, but it's also different. And it's interesting to do the compare and contrast and see how the differences change things. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about strategic combat in the universe. And by that, I mean, like, how do you set up your defenses and what it looks like in system, when you're coming in to attack a system and when you're defending a system. It's pretty much just what I did with the albedo stuff. But it's very interesting. And but before I do this, I'm going to point out one of the things that this thing really has, and it's really cool about it, is there are currently, I didn't even count how many, but he's done a lot of background stuff. He's done, thank you, Lissa, for putting that up there. It's also that URL is also in the show notes. So if you want to just go to YouTube and cut and paste, you can get it from there. He's done a lot of background stuff. And so basically, as near as I can tell, what happens is he goes and he does posts on the forum associated with it. And then he'll collect all the stuff together and turn it into an essay, and he'll put it up on the website. And so, like, there's an essay on the FTL technology and how it works. There's an essay on the different ship types, which I'm really not going to go into in this much at all. But there's an essay on the different ship types. There's an essay on the different races. There's an essay on the precursor empires. The history of this universe goes back a couple of million years, which I'm not really going to talk about tonight. I mean, you can go and never read the webcomic and spend days and days just reading through the stuff that's in the background section. So if you go to Well of Souls, go to Outsider, there's a tab at the top called Insider, and that's where all the background stuff is. And I've pulled from that background for this talk. And one of the things in that background is a little thing he did that is the Registry of Blue Peoples. And so what he's done is he's collected all the different places in, like, TV and comics and animated stuff where there
is
are
that fucking Animorphs?
It might be. I forget which
the middle
ones.
one?
I can't remember which ones I pulled out. There's 100+ entries in his Registry of Blue Peoples. And so I got 3 of them and just threw them off to the side. But there's like a little encyclopedia entry on each one. There's like
no, that's fucking Animorphs.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Yeah, and then he's also got some honorable mentions, like is it Mystique? That's the Marvel character that's cool.
There's several blue Marvel characters,
yeah,
but she's one. Yes,
Mystique, I think, is in there because she's not a race; she's just one person, so she gets an honorable mention. But she isn't actually a blue peoples; she's a blue person.
I don't know. I would argue technically she kind of is because she did spring. She is the father of Nightcrawler.
Well, I tell you what, I'll let you argue with Jim Francis over
I would argue there's kind of an asterisk there because she is the progenitor of multiple mutants.
Could be. Now, one of the things that I also like is next to every entry, you can see that key of common characteristics like pointed ears and white hair and stuff like that. So he's not only got 100+ entries, and there's like 20 honorable mentions, and I stopped counting at 100. I started at Z and was going backwards, counting them all, and I got up to
Delon gets it. Delon gets it. Nightcrawler and Beast are also blue.
Yeah,
and
but
they're not the only ones.
They're not the same race. That's my point. And so you go up, when I was counting backwards, I stopped counting at 100 because I could just say there's more than 100, but there was like 20 honorable mentions also. So it's probably like on the order of like 130 entries in this thing. And he's got the common characteristics like, whether they have pointed ears and stuff like that. So he's got little symbols next to each one. So
whether they're space elves.
Yes. And it's, and whether there's a caste system and the whole bit. So I love his stuff. At one point he says missiles in this universe, the Loroi in this universe use missiles the same way that the St. Louis Rams use timeouts. They're vaguely aware of them. They expend them. They don't have very many. They expend them all early, and then they just don't think about them after that. And so that's actually a reference to when Jim Martz was the coach of the St. Louis Rams. They were famous for being really bad at timeouts, but I find he puts little things like that in there. That's kind of nice. And so it's worth just going and roaming through the site to catch stuff like that. Okay,
he's not wrong to point out that a lot of them do seem to have white hair in particular.
Yes,
that does seem to follow the trope.
Yes, and there's also
it's not guaranteed, but it is like it feels like maybe like 7 times out of 10 sort of situation.
Yeah.
It is an awful lot.
It is an awful lot. Okay, so I've already talked about what the webcomic is. It's by Ariok, aka Jim Francis.
Also, another blue person with white hair. I would like to point out, Eric.
Yeah, and I think the Farscape blue people are listed. I could be wrong on that. I could be wrong. I to be honest, I didn't go through and do an honest to goodness survey. I only found it this afternoon.
Actually, in retrospect, I think he's talking about the species that the priestess is from. I was thinking of the other one that's introduced later. But she's also a blue person with white hair.
Oh, yeah. I mean, blue and white go together really well.
They do.
I haven't had a chance to go through and read the entire registry of blue peoples because it's actually relatively recent. He put it up in 2023, and and it's down in the corner at the very bottom. And I hadn't discovered it until this afternoon, and I was busy putting the slides together. I didn't really have time to do it. So in any event, what is Outsider? Outsider is the story of Ensign Second Class Alexander Jardin, who is the sole survivor of the Earth Scout Bellarmine, which there's an image of Bellarmine, which was destroyed on an alien contact mission. It stumbled into the midst of a battle between the two warring alien races, the Loroi and the Umiak, and it just sort of wandered into the battle. And he's the only survivor, and he's rescued by the Loroi. And he has adventures. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. And there's like 200 and some pages so far in this webcomic. So I'm looking mostly in this, I'm going through mostly the background notes to it in the insider section. So I've sort of culled through that, and I pulled most of the images from there, not all of them. Like the last one was from a panel, and this one's from a panel. And this is right after they're attacked And Alexander and Ellen, one of the other ensigns, are they're like just suited up for damage control. The attack happens and they don't know what's going on. They just know that they're trying to survey the damage afterwards. And they eventually get to the point where they discover that the ship has been cut in half by whatever the attack was. And then the attack gets worse after that. They start firing on the pieces that are left. And Alexander ends up in a spacesuit, just sort of floating free, and he ends up as the only survivor. The science is relatively hardish, and by that I mean there's some magic fusion torches and stuff like that. But he's got a reasonably good, he's clearly doing some math behind the scenes to sort of figure out how stuff would work. And he's thought through a bunch of the implications about greater range versus lesser range and weapon systems and stuff like that. It's more consistent than Albedo. It's probably less hard in its declared hardness, but probably more hard in its actual hardness. Albedo tries to be hard science fiction, isn't as hard as it would like to be. But I think that Outsiders pretty much is as hard science fiction as it would like to be. There's a lot of background material there. There's like basically a lot of the races in this section of the galaxy are descendants of an alien empire that fell apart like hundreds of thousands of years ago. And and it's one of the reasons why they can go to various places and they can find like there's a particular type of grain that you find all over this section of space, and it's because the previous precursor empire planted it all over the place as a food crop, and that's been very useful for various people. And when you get into the history of the Leroy, there's like 4 or 5 distinct centers of Leroy civilization that they were clearly part of this empire. The empire fell apart. They sort of fell back into barbarism, and then they started building spacecrafts and recontacting each other. And it's like, oh yeah, you're clearly like me, and you got the pointy ears and the blue skin, but you're a different shade of blue. Okay, so that's great. And so one of the things is Alexander's trying to sort of learn all this stuff. And there's also the fact that some of them are telepaths, and there's sort of a separate set of, the telepaths act different than the non-telepaths do. And he's trying to learn all the cultural things and not offend people. Luckily, they actually have a diplomat on board whose job it is to go and sort of figure out how alien cultures work and interface with them and sort of help, be the grease in between the two societies. And so Alexander's basically been adopted by this woman whose job it is to sort of make all that happen. And so let's see. I must admit I'm not real wild about the ship designs. I think the ship designs overall they kind of leave me cold. That's one of the reasons why I'm not going hardcore into the ship design stuff. But I do like some things, like, for instance, if you go through the ship design section for like the Leroy, which we got a sort of a better picture of, they've been fighting this war for decades. And over time, their doctrine has changed. And so like the main ship, the main Leroy ship, is the sole surviving member of its class. And it has certain capabilities that kind of make it useful, but it's not the thing they're building these days. And, some of that's changing as they have to build stuff faster, because basically the Leroy are generally higher technology level, generally have longer range weapons, but they don't have as much industrial capability, and they don't have as their stuff isn't as efficient, and they're sort of getting steamrolled by the Umiak, just because there's more of them. The story is slowly coming out one page at a time. I mean, he'll put an announcement on the website saying, hey, new page. As you can see, this is sort of like kind of the typical thing. Between April of 2023 and October of 2024, he did a total of 7 pages. And that's actually, he had spun up a little bit. And so for a while there, he like in 2022, I think it was, there was like next to nothing. But he does them as he can. And so, hey, that's great. I give him money to encourage him to do them faster. But he's currently on page 226, and it's a pretty quick read. Like, for instance, what we see in the right-hand side, that's a full page. So it's a pretty quick read. You're much, much, much more likely to get bogged down in the insider section, because that's the one that's all words and not, there's some illustrations, which you'll see a bunch of the illustrations, but it's mostly words. Okay, so next slide. So the background of this story is that on Halloween of 2158, this shipload of refugees arrives in human space. Humanity at this point has like 6 colony worlds, I think, or 5 colony worlds or something like that. And these people arrive. They're an alien species, and they're fleeing this decades-long, ever-widening conflict between the insectoid Umiak and the mysterious telepathic Loroi. Blue space elves. Think blue space elves. Neither side in this war really accepts neutrality. The Loroi, we don't really have any Umiak characters to have perspectives on. The Loroi seem to not have they seem to not really accept neutrality because they got stabbed in the back in the past. The Umiak basically struck first and kind of out of the blue. It's like there had been like a minor disagreement, and it's like, why are you starting a war over this? Like we're talking, we're in the negotiation phase. Why are you starting a war over this? And there's been some other instances where neutrals were not able to defend their territory, and as a result, the neutrals ended up as bases. Umiak bases ended up in neutral territory to attack the Loroi. And so as a result of that, the Loroi are sort of picky about that. And the other thing is that there's at least one instance where the Umiak took over one of the Loroi core planets. It's like sort of the outlying core planet, and killed a couple of billion people. And so the Loroi are sort of cranky about that as well. So the refugees warn the Earth that, hey, this is the way this works. You're going to have to pick a side. Our people did not pick a side, and we're kind of, that's why we're on the run now. But you're probably going to have to pick a side, but which one? And so Earth sends out a set of scout ships from their scouting service, specifically to make contact and to try to get a lay of the land. There's something about they're trying to figure out who the winner is going to be. Because they don't want to pick the losing side, but they don't have any information other than they know it's the Loroi and the Umiak. And they know that there's some other races involved, and that both sides are both combatants are the leading race in a confederation of stuff. So there's a big group on each side, but they're the main combatants. And so, okay, we gotta send out some scout ships and figure out what's going on. On day 58 of the mission, the Bellarmine is destroyed. It stumbles into a system where there's a space battle taking place. Their plan is to sort of hang out at the edge of the system and wait to see what happens. And all of a sudden, they're under attack, and they don't really see the attacker coming. The perspective when they go to battle stations and all of this, at that point you're focused on Alexander and Ellen and the other youngsters that are there to do damage control, and they don't have any perspective on what's going on in this battle. They just know that all of a sudden the ship rings like a bell. It got hit pretty hard. There's they're losing atmosphere. There's damage. There's smoke, and it turns out the ship's been cut in two, and then things get really bad. And Jarden is the only survivor. He ends up being rescued by the Loroi, who sort of give him promotion to being captain of the ship as the sole survivor. He was the acting captain when the ship was finally destroyed, and the Loroi claim that they don't know who killed the ship, but there's a little bit of reason to think that maybe the Loroi aren't totally and completely honest. You're clearly supposed to think that they're the good guys, I think, but maybe they're not totally and completely honest about what's going on. But they decide that, he was on a diplomatic mission, and so they need to get him to the Loroi capital. And so they take measures to do that, which run right into the buzzsaw of a major Umiak offensive. And Jarden gets to have adventures as a result of that. And so that's kind of where we're at. They're in the process of trying to stay out of the hands of the Umiak and last long enough for a rescue to be mounted. But they're in a situation where there's a huge battle taking place across a wide variety of space, and they're like one shuttle's worth of people. And so, do we think there's going to be a rescue attempt anytime soon? Who knows? So that's the background. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about weapons types, and I'm not going to go into huge detail of the different types because there's a very nice essay where he talks about all this stuff. The important thing to take away here is that there's a lot of different weapon types, and there's a lot of, I put great differences by race on plasma weapons because that seems to really be a place where the differences are very huge, but everybody's got differences here. And so some people do particle beams more than others. The Leroy basically have longer range weapons. You can see their weapons range out to about a light second, but they've also got some issues with slow rate of fire. The Umiak have some really hard-hitting stuff, but it's really kind of shorter ranged stuff. And so this sort of leads the Leroy in a situation where they're trying to take long-range shots, but some of their stuff, some of their really powerful stuff has slow rates of fire. And if that sounds a lot like naval combat in the Dreadnought era, then yes, it does. Where early on there was very much of a discussion about whether you wanted lots of quick firing guns or whether you wanted hard hitting things that could penetrate armor if they hit. And so that kind of went back and forth in the days before HMS Dreadnought. And then Dreadnought comes along, and Dreadnought is sort of like, that's the Royal Navy putting down the marker saying, yep, we've kind of decided that the right answer is to go with the big guns. And partially it was because they had many, if not all of the elements of fire control in place. So they were more likely to get hits. And they also increased the size of the ships to the point where they could get good size salvos. And so they could increase their probability of hitting by having a good size salvo. And you may recall, I haven't talked about it in a while, but Frank Chadwick in the essay that went with the game Star Cruiser, he talks about how the history of combat is a history of trying to solve the targeting problem. And these are ways that you can solve the targeting problem. You can increase your accuracy, you can increase the volume of fire, you can counter that by making your weapons, the enemy's weapons, ineffective by having armor, or you can make yourself harder to hit. Let's see, I think I covered everything in there, except you can also increase the performance of your weapon by like making sure that the ballistic properties of your gun are such that you can do a better job of pointing the shell in the direction you want it to go. And so when I read through this, I see a lot of the same things here. Torpedoes in particular are kind of interesting. They're like fighter-sized things. They got big drives. They frequently will have sub-munitions that are basically regular missiles. They've also got some carried craft in the form of fighters and gunboats that carry missiles. But a lot of this war is done by units that are doing deep raiding. And there's offensives where they're clearly outrunning their supply lines. In fact, the Leroy in particular do deep raids into enemy territory with ships that emphasize energy weapons, plasma, particle beams, things like that, because they know they're not going to get resupply. And they'll do like a 2-month-long penetration into enemy space. They go around, they kill a bunch of stuff, don't get pinned down. The idea is to do fast runs through and kill as much stuff as they can and then hightail it back to their own space. So that's basically how that works. Let's see, is there anything else that I want to say about scale here? Oh yeah, there is something else I want to say about scale, and that's the light speed lag issue. So I cut my teeth on TML, the Traveler Mailing List, and all the things that went along with it. And one of the things that was one of the perennial discussions there was missiles versus lasers, missiles versus energy weapons. So on the one hand, energy weapons can have a tremendously long range. As long as you've got electrical power in the form of your magic fusion plant, you can fire the things generally. And so there's, you don't have to do all the resupply stuff. So energy weapons are kind of a good thing in that regard. The problem with energy weapons is that the main range limitation is that you have to increase the amount of dwell time over long distances to do anything, because your beam spot gets bigger, so you have to increase the amount of dwell time. But you also have this issue with light speed lag affects your targeting. And so if you're taking laser fire, you're going to be trying to jink around to throw off the other guy's aim, because if you're a light second away, you can potentially move a fair amount of distance in a light second. Now, maybe, right? You're not using the main drive of the ship, because you're certainly not rotating the ship around to use the main drive. So you're using whatever side thrusters you have, et cetera, to jink around. At the very least, even if the guy has a spot on you, you're moving the spot to a clean part of armor, right? So if the idea is that he has to burn through your armor by concentrating on your armor for a period of time, if you're constantly sliding the armor around underneath that spot, it'll take longer for him to get through. One of the ways you counter that is you try to have your pulse length as short as possible. You would much rather put, and I'm just picking a unit at random, a Godzilla watt, right? If you're going to put a Godzilla watt on target, you'd much rather put a Godzilla watt in 5 nanoseconds than put it in over 5 minutes. For a bunch of reasons. One is you put all the energy on the target, so you don't have to worry about the guy sliding the armor around underneath you. And the other thing is that you get thermal shock effects and stuff like that. You blow off the outer edge of the armor, and that actually functions as if it were a kinetic hit. I mean, you cause an explosion on the armor, and that explosion sort of goes through, the shock wave goes through the armor, and it helps with penetration and things like that. In fact, we've designed some weapons. I'm thinking specifically of the nuclear-powered anti-ballistic missile stuff that we did back in the 60s. That stuff was designed to maximize the amount of radiation they put on target. It was basically neutron warheads designed to give a real quick pulse to the armor, or to the skin anyway, of the incoming nuclear warhead of the reentry vehicle, and cause the skin to blow off, cause the skin to explode and damage the internals. And so that you can do the same thing with lasers. And so I look at this and I go, okay, the Leroy, hey, it's great that you've got this long range weapon, but it doesn't necessarily help as much as you might think. And I haven't gone back and done all the math to sort of figure out what the accelerations are and how much you can expect people to jink around and stuff like that. I just haven't done that. That could potentially be interesting to do. Okay, next slide. All right, so this guy's clearly a gamer. He is clearly a gamer. Here's a bunch of plasma weapons and the damage they do by the type of weapon and the distance. And he's got a rate of fire column at the end. It's clearly broken into a particular time step, i.e. a turn. And then there's some notes on the type of thing. And yeah, he's clearly a gamer. And he specifically mentions GURPS. And he specifically mentions the Gorn Khanate War supplement to Starfire. So yeah, he's clearly a gamer. And he may have said more about exactly where he's getting stuff, how he's processing it from a gaming perspective. I went looking for it. I thought that he specifically said something other than GURPS in there, but I may have been thinking of the GURPS thing. I need to go back and double check. So Stephen Ross asks a really good question. It's worth jumping in for. If your enemy's 12 light seconds out, your LiDAR return is 24 seconds old, right? Because you send out a pulse and it comes back, and it's at that point it's 24 seconds old. So the consensus opinion seems to be that the longer you go out, the more likely it is that you're using passive for targeting. Now, I've talked about the kill chain in the past, and so you may Depending upon how far out you're coming in from jump, etc., you may have a big radar and you're sort of pulse mapping the entire system, and you're detecting people from radar. But if you've got a big magic fusion torch, you're probably detecting the big fusion flame. If you don't, and ships are crawling through, like say a thruster plate in Traveler terms, you might be doing a big pulse because that gives you some very precise data involved in all of that. But that's a detection at that level. That's going to be a detection system. It's not going to be a targeting system. For targeting, you're probably going to be using passive for exactly this reason. If you're 12 light seconds out, if you're using active radar, your data is 24 seconds old by the time you get it. 12 out, 12 back. If you're using passive, it's only 12 seconds old. That helps. Okay. So here's another gamer aside. He specifically references that this chart is based upon the Gorn Kane or supplement to Starfire. And this is basically what ends up happening. You know, if there's an enemy invasion, you end up having to send stuff back to where the fleet reserve is to call for help. And there's no FTL comms in this universe. You send a ship, you send a courier back to go to the fleet and get help. And you go to wherever the fleet is, you go to the sector capital, et cetera, et cetera. And they've got a specific command and control network with relay bases, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically the Pony Express going to go get the cavalry. So yeah, very much a gamer. Okay, so let's talk about the jump drive, which of course is the thing that reminded me of albedo. In fact, this illustration at the bottom is I used it for the albedo, the last albedo thing. It's a point-to-point hyperspace travel thing like albedo. Jump drive propels you through hyperspace to a target star, which pulls you in. You need a mass on your end, you need a mass on the other end, but your jump drive gets you out of the gravity well and in and to the point where you can re-embed in the gravity well of the other side. Now, for this, he uses, actually, I'm skipping ahead. I'm not going to do that. In the upper right-hand corner, you know, he specifically says, hey, you don't have to have be center of mass. You just kind of need to be close to the star, and you need to be pointing in the right direction. Now, the one thing he never really explains is, why do you have to be close to a star? It's not clear to me why you have to be close to a star, except maybe this angle of re-embedding, which I'm going to talk about. Maybe that's part of it, but I'm not quite sure. In albedo terms, I think Galactica does a better job of sort of explaining how that works in albedo terms. That having been said, I think that Jim Francis does a fantastic job with the essay on this, and I encourage you to all go read it if you are interested in this sort of thing, which I'm willing to bet you are because you're watching Starfleet Tactical on Saturday night at 9 o'clock. So as it says here, the jumping starship must be within the proper outbound zone. So you got to be in sort of the same general direction, and you aim at the destination star, and then you sort of get pulled in at the destination star. In fact, one of the things he says that is a limitation on the range is your ability to precisely target the destination star. You are leaving from a star that is moving. You are going to a star that is moving. It says specifically that you keep your vector. There's nothing that sort of explores the idea that if your stars are going in different directions, your resulting vector when you get there may be wildly skewed from the target star. He doesn't really talk about that. Most science fiction that talks about keeping your vector when you do a jump doesn't really act like stars are moving. But he does explicitly talk about how stars are moving when he talks about how you do the navigation to get to the next star. So that's pretty cool. Okay. So in the upper right-hand corner, we have a representation. Actually, in both of them, we have this representation of this ballistic trajectory through hyperspace. So think 4 or 5-dimensional ballistic trajectory, not 3-dimensional, right? Because it's not like you're actually, you know, the Einsteinian space-time is a rubber sheet is a metaphor. It's not actually flat like that. So he talks about doing a ballistic trajectory through hyperspace. You get this big impulse when you activate the drive. After that, you are coasting in a ballistic trajectory, and you're going to intersect normal space at some point down the journey, and you need to aim correctly so that you when you get to normal space, you do it correctly. You must have, like I said, there a mass on both ends of the jump, so you can't jump from deep space. So if you're going to go to deep space, you got to slog out there and you got to slog back. Maximum range is 6 to 10 light years. Now, you may recall from Albedo, it was 5 to 30 light years, but in this case, it's about 6 to 10 light years, but it's largely for the same reason as Albedo. You know, part of the reason in Albedo was interference from other stars along the path. In Albedo, they shove you. It's unclear as to whether they shove you. It seems to be that they shove you. Albedo gets sort of fuzzy in the language. Like, it talks about the star pulling you in, but it also talks about it shoving you away. I kind of, in my head, go with the metaphor that it's always shoving you. In this case, it's pulling you in. And so, like, if there's lots of stars along the path, you may get sucked into the wrong destination. And because you're not following the proper ballistic trajectory, you run into problems when you get there, and you may bounce, which I'll talk about right now. Okay, so he talks very much about how you have to come in and at sort of the notionally kind of the same angle that you were at when you left. Remember, this is in multiple dimensions. And so he talks about how if you hit at the wrong location, you want to kind of be at the same level of gravitational potential that you left from. And you can adjust it with the drive. You know, you can jump early, you can jump late, you can arrive early, you can arrive late. But you're kind of aiming for approximately the same level of gravitational potential. If you go too deep, you'll get sucked into the star, and that would be bad. You also theoretically can hit planets, but the star's so much bigger, and it's sort of at the center of the well, so it funnels you into it. It's literally a gravitational funnel. If you go too long, you're likely to hit the star. But you can also do things like, if you've got too much power in your jump and you're coming in at the wrong angle, you can actually basically pass through real space from positive hyperspace where you've been to negative hyperspace. At least they think that's what's going on. Nobody has come back to explain to them what failed. So there's a whole bunch of ideas in here about, like, okay, we think this is what's going on. We think that this is a way that you can fail, but it's not always clear. And so, like, for instance, if your ballistic trajectory is too shallow, you just miss it altogether. If you're not pointed in the right direction, you miss it altogether. If you hit at the wrong angle, you may bounce off a real space and go and stay in positive hyperspace. If you hit too hard, you may go all the way through. So in a lot of ways, it's a lot trickier than jumping in Albedo. And there's all sorts of bad things that can happen. Okay, so what are the implications for strategic combat? The astute amongst you will note that this is the exact same slide that I used for the Albedo talk, with the exception that the stuff down at the end about bigger stars pushing harder, farther, I grayed that out. It is unclear in in Outsider what effect the size of the star has. He doesn't really spend a whole lot of time talking about that. By implication, if you're jumping to a big star, like, you probably don't want to jump into a neutron star because it's probably just going to suck you in. But he doesn't really spend a whole lot of time talking about that. But other than that, you've got the same implications that you've got from Albedo. There's no one jump point. There's really a jump corridor, and it's like AUs long. And so your ability to sort of, well, I won't get into all the, actually, this is the time to get into that. So your ability to, like, put a station there or put defenders there It's not like an Alderson point. It's not like warp points in Starfire where it's right there. I can measure where the gate area where they're going to come through. I know exactly where it is, and as a result, I can have stuff there with all the guns pointed. That isn't how this works out. It's actually a pretty big area. Likewise, you can tell things like, if he comes in at this location, he came from that star. If he left at this location, he's going to that star. And so even though you can't get the exact point down, you can know where the closest stars are and hence where the entry points are going to be. Stationing a force there so that you can mug the guy when he comes through may be hard, but you know approximately where that force is going to come in. And so you can be prepared. If nothing else, you can have a bunch of sensors pointed in that direction so you see him when he jumps in. So it gives you a lot of ability. I always think like a gamer in this. In addition, thinking like a science fiction guy, right? It gives you a lot of ability to sort of do some planning on what you're going to do. And it gives you some intel on where people are coming from and where they're going to, without turning it into what Starfire kind of turns into, which is, how many forts can I put around this warp point? I've got 47 forts around this warp point. Can I fit in a 48th? And so you end up with these situations where it's just, slogging matches there. And so you can avoid all that, but it's kind of hard to, it gives you enough geography that you can work with it without so much geography that everything's a choke point. Stephen Ross asked the question, do you have to lead your destination star? And I think the answer is yeah, you do have to lead your destination star. Now, it was pointed out in the albedo talk, somebody pointed out that like if you're in multiple star systems, you've got really pretty good parallax measurements. I kind of get the impression that the author thinks that this is harder than it really would be in this situation. I told you guys the story about Bruce McIntosh, somebody on the Traveler mailing list saying, well, you got to understand that this is about pointing a laser. You got to understand you'd have to have this level of precision to do it. And Bruce's response was, I'm an astronomer. We do that all the time. And I think that's the case here too. You're going to be able to get lots of parallax measurements from lots of different directions. You're always going to kind of know where the next star is. And so my guess is you've got pretty good charts and you're going to be pretty good at this. The complicating factor is going to be things like, do I have to do it while I'm under fire? Right? Planning and executing the exact precise lineup necessary to get to a particular destination might be dodgy if I'm running for my life at the time. And under most circumstances, it probably isn't. And I would expect that the bigger issue is going to be the influence of all the other stars around there. Now, that having been said, I just thought about something he said. He explicitly says that hyperspace is kind of chaotic and it's not just about the real space measurement, but when you go through hyperspace, there's a certain amount of chaos that happens from going through hyperspace. In the same way that if you're on a golf course and you tee off the ball, you're going to have wind and other things that even if your mechanics are perfect, you're still going to have other things affecting the flight path of that ball. And so going through hyperspace inherently adds a level of uncertainty to it. And that's one of the issues involved. I had forgotten that he said that. So, okay. So let's compare these jump drives. So up top, we've got the illustration I used for both the discussion of albedo and the discussion on tonight on Outsider, from the Outsider website, from the FTL Tech article there that sort of explains in general how that works. And then I've compared the ballistic trajectory thing to the albedo illustration from Steve Galactica. The biggest thing is, in Outsider, it's a well. In albedo, it's a hill. right? The star's pushing you. You're a marble and you're rolling down a hill and you're rolling up another hill at the other end. Versus I have to, I'm jumping out of a well and I'm going to get sucked into a well at the other end. So this has some interesting implications for like exactly how that catching mechanism works, and how far up the hill you roll and things like that, and how you can adjust that. And so I tried to capture a lot of that in this particular slide here. So in albedo, stars are generally pushing. In outsider, they're generally pulling. The maximum range in albedo is greater, but okay, pick a number. You can that can be somewhat arbitrary. The reason for the maximum range in albedo is that you can only stay in hyperspace for so long. Right now there is an interference issue, right? In both cases, you've got this interference issue that limits range. But assuming no interference, you can only stay in hyperspace for so long before elements above oxygen on the periodic table start to spontaneously fission, and that is bad because you end up, if you stay in hyperspace long enough, the entire ship just sort of falls apart, and all you get is gas that comes out at the other end. In outsider, it's about lack of precision in targeting because hyperspace is inherently chaotic, and as a result, even if you've got a pretty precise idea where that star is, it's going to throw you off. What actually causes you to reappear at the other end? And it's the gravity hill in albedo, and it's the gravity well at the other side in outsider, with the idea that in outsider, you really you got this sort of hyperspatial angle of embedding that you're trying to come in at a particular angle so you don't bounce off like a stone being skipped on a pond or punching all the way through. You can't jump in system in either one, and that's because in albedo, if you try to jump in system, the big mass of the star is just going to shove you into interstellar space. If you're not actually on the line of flight to another star, you end up in interstellar space, and since you don't have anything to jump off of, you won't have the fuel to get back to someplace where you need to be. Where you can actually push off a star again. In outsider, it's that the departure star will eat you, right? If you try to do a low power jump in system, the departure star will just vacuum you up. You get sucked into the gravity well of the departure star. You have to put enough power into your drive to force it out of the gravity well. I specifically added this idea about this hyperspace angle thing of the ballistic hyperspace angle in outsider is really important. He spends a lot of time talking about that. And in neither case do we know about the effect of the size of the star. They don't really go into talking about that a whole lot. Now, I really like both of these systems. I really like them both. If I had to pick one, and I would be wearing my would-be science fiction novelist / science fiction game designer hat if I was picking one, I would pick the albedo one because I think that with modifications, I can do an awful lot of that. Last time I talked about the idea, like, what if bigger stars push you farther? And what if you can jump off of neutron stars? And what if the fact that you're jumping off a neutron star adds this idea that now you've got a minimum range in addition to a maximum range? Because if you try to jump to something too close and you get this really big shove from a neutron star, that it'll just push you right into the destination star, and that would be bad. You don't want to climb so far up the hill that you then fall into the top of the cone and get eaten by the star at the other end. And so I think I can do more with the Galactica explanation about how albedo works than in terms of making modifications to it than I can with the outsider drive. That having been said, the outsider drive with this angle of embed, et cetera, puts a lot more constraints on it, and constraints are inherently interesting. I've heard David Weber say 12 times at least about how constraints are good for authors. They force you to be creative, and they force you to come up with solutions that the readers like, as opposed to it just looking like it's a cop-out because you made up the universe and you just made up this capability. So that's sort of sort of element. Limitations are good for writers, and so from that side, Outsider has some fantastic limitations that Albedo doesn't have. So I'm going to go back and go through comments in just a second. I think that might be the last slide, and it is indeed. So this is an illustration of the bridge of the Tempest, which is the Leroy cruiser that rescues Alexander Jardin. That purple thing in the middle is a hologram from a race called the Historians. The Historians are a technologically sophisticated race that don't have very many systems. You sort of get the impression that they used to be the big dog in this part of the galaxy, maybe. And they certainly have a lot of technology, and they're sharing some of it with the Leroy. And what you're seeing there is a hologram that's coming out of the thing underneath them, which is actually like a portable AI representative of the Historians. I believe it is said that nobody's actually laid eyes on an actual historian and know what they look like. But they're called the Historians because they're really long-lived, and they've sort of collected a bunch of information about this part of the universe. I don't think they call themselves the Historians. I think that's just sort of what they're called by everybody else. And so actually, if you go to the Outsider website, the Insider section, there is an illustration that has numbers to all of these bridge positions. I think actually maybe it's from even a different angle, and will tell you what each of those people are doing, what their bridge position is. And it's kind of cool. It's kind of cool. The Historians, by the way, remember how I said that the Leroy are kind of sneaky, and it's unclear as to whether they're totally and completely above board. We get that information from the Historians. The Historians actually sort of say, like, you should keep your eyes open. So, okay, all right. Now it's time to go back through comments and see what we've got. The bridge does have a mission control vibe. I also like this bridge. Bob, I look forward to seeing what you're going to do in Space Master using these ideas. Let's see. Mike asks, hill versus well. If you always had to jump from a hill to a well, would some stars not be accessible from your point of origin? The hill analogy is the albedo analogy, and the well analogy is the outsider analogy. I wasn't trying to sort of mix those metaphors. But I do like the idea that if you're pushing off the stars, this is one, like I said, this is the reason why I really like the albedo system. And I think there's a little bit more that I can modify with it, in particular in designing a board game. I like the idea that if you're pushing off the stars, the size of the stars determines how big a push you get. Now, I'm pretty sure if the outsider creator were here, he'd say, like, yeah, you can't jump into neutron stars. You have a problem jumping in the big stars. You probably have a problem jumping in the big stars because they have a tendency to just sort of vacuum you up. And so my guess is it's harder to jump into bigger stars. So, okay, let's see, going back. Hyperspace ski ball, I like that. Centerline turrets better than wing turrets, Wright points out. Yes, that's centerline turrets were one of those things that for a long time they didn't do centerline turrets, and that's because they still had sails. You had these steel warships that had sails, they had rigging. And the reason why they did that is because coal steam power wasn't particularly efficient, and so it was tough to cross an ocean on steam power. It was tough to, it was dominant tactically, right? You had to have steam power when you got to the battle, but you didn't want to be trying to use steam power to get across an ocean. They solved that problem by making more efficient steam engines and making the ships bigger. And when they did that, and also developing coaling stations, so there was always some place you could go get coal. And when that happened, they could take that rigging down. And then it started making sense to put centerline turrets, which allowed you to have bigger guns, and have them sort of more balanced in terms of buoyancy of the ship. And so it all sort of fed into each other. Incidentally, I've never really talked about this, but I think that steam thing is also one of the reasons why the Jean Nicole school thought that, you could defend with torpedo boats, is because, steam was inherently a short-ranged thing. And so I can have these steamboats, and I'm going to be fighting these ships that have all these other things too, sails and all the other crap that goes along with it. Now, that having been said, I'd have to go back and spend some time with a timeline and sort of figure out whether I'm taking ideas from two different timelines and two different parts of the timeline, and I'm mashing them together or not. But on the surface, it's an interesting question worth me going back and doing some exploring. So Steve Ross asks if the Umiak are the space Russians. You kind of get that impression, but you really don't see anything from the Umiak point of view, right? You've got one human character, one or two other human characters that die almost immediately, or back on Earth. And so you've got a bunch of Leroy characters, and then you've got this one historian character. And so you don't really have a perspective on the Umiak. They're off screen the entire time. Okay. So, Wright points out that blue and white makes a good color choice for Shelby Mustangs as well. That is indeed true. Let's see, going back. Okay, I think I'm back to the beginning. Now let me scroll back to the end. Stephen Ross says the less said about HMS Captain, the better. Yeah, that can be the case. Let's see. I don't think I've got anything else at this point. So I think it's probably time to declare victory and perhaps just go ahead and end the stream. So next time, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. It's probably, I want to do the Franz Joseph stuff, but I want to have Pat available for that. Franz Joseph is really kind of interesting because, and Starfleet Battles, and how the technology works there. So Starfleet Battles is sort of a spin out of Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph's idea about how warp engines work, for instance, is not what we see in the canon anymore, right? This is before the canon existed on that. So he invented something. And that, when it's processed through Starfleet Battles, like warp speed in Starfleet Battles means something entirely different. And it includes the idea that there are certain parts of the galaxy that are faster than others because there's a particle density element to it. That warp engines work better when the particle density is low. And it doesn't seem to be just my navigational deflectors can't deal with the particle density. It seems to be actually, no, really, they work faster. That it does something to the warp field, which is very interesting. And that's one of the reasons why I also want to do Chris Muller's Iron Empires, because that's exactly how his distortion drives work. They're limited to particle density. And then you've got all these interesting things where, like he specifically points out, that I can go my fastest in areas of space where the particle density is lowest, away from the planets. That's where I can go fastest. But I use up all my fuel. And in order to get fuel, I have to go to places where the particle density is higher. And then there's some interesting things about how the weapons work, including weapons that really destructive weapons that you could shoot out of a gravity well, but for reasons involving particle density, you can't shoot back in. And so you end up with like specialized ships that are just designed to fight inside gravity wells. And it's really, really a fascinating background. And he's got some very interesting things in how armor works, et cetera. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you all about it. Basically, I've kind of decided that every cool thing on my bookshelf is going to get an episode at some point or another. So I got a lot of cool things on my bookshelf. So we're going to keep on doing this for a while. So Mike DiCarlo asks a great question here. I'll answer this real quick. The episode about how warp drive was destroying subspace. Yeah, it's a very interesting episode. It was something where it was a particular region of space which were for something having to do with how it was set up. Everybody took exactly the same course, and as a result, they were eroding subspace way faster. And it led to some speed restrictions and stuff like that. But then you get things like, oh, okay, we came up with this new warp drive that it doesn't do that, and the geometries are different, et cetera, and they very quickly sort of just like got rid of it. And that really seems to be the case because it kind of limited the writers and what they could do. Now, in some of the cases, you see them ignoring it. It's like, okay, it's a survival of the ship thing. So yeah, if I got to survive, if the alternative is the ship gets destroyed, I'm going to go ahead and go to warp 8. But you also get some things, some hints at least that they did things like all the ships became longer and sleeker, and that seems to be something to do with that. And maybe that's why we saw a whole bunch of new engine designs. Right? Those fat TNG engines kind of disappeared. And then with Enterprise E, you end up with the long, thin engines and the long, thin ship design. And that seems to be part of this. I was listening to, I think it was Sci Insanity show about this within the last couple of days. And at one point, the guy doing the show said something to the effect of that it affected and I absolutely hate the fact that I'm going to use this word, aerodynamic properties of the warp field. And I thought it was funny as well. So yeah, that's an interesting episode. And I'm sure at some point I'll have Andy Presby on the show and we'll talk about that. Yeah. Olive points out they could have done a better job with that. They sort of created this thing that was going to be a recurring thing, and then they immediately sort of fixed it so that it really had no impact other than I'm going to have to buy a whole bunch of new gear, and it just kind of went away. And so it's like, hey, I've got this great narrative device, but the narrative device really kind of constrains me so much, so I'm just going to ignore it. All right, okay. It's their show; they can do what they want. Okay, so with that in mind, I think it's time to go ahead and call it an episode. Once again, I am always just tremendously pleased that there's a group of people that are willing to spend their Saturday night listening to me talk. As the designated extrovert in the group, that pleases me a great deal, and I am humbled by that fact, and I am honored by that fact. So, thank you once again. Let's do this again soon, almost certainly next week. And thank you very much, everybody. See you next time.